In this video, I will comment chronologically the beginning of the first half of this small book by Ernest Renan, a French author of the 19th century. Qu'est-ce qu'une nation? What is a nation? And I will make the introduction and then the structure of the video. You can see the structure down in the description. There are 26 points with the title, so you can go directly to the point which might interest you most. First, the introduction. This book, the comment of this book, will enable you and myself to understand the French mind, for lack of a more accurate description, and eventually the French spirit, the French mindset. It might enable you, if you're interested, to understand today's presidential election, because the present is a result of the past, and it might enable you to understand past history, notably European history, and also present history in the West and in the world at large. The question that this book tries to answer is, what is a nation? And it gives a French perspective on the idea of a nation. And this book, it cost $2. That's a very short book. That's a speech. It was a speech originally. This book is one of the most well-known books in France, but it is never read. It's the kind of book that people who are broadly educated know about, but they have never read the book. It's often quoted, but probably never read. And if I had to imagine an equivalent, I would say it's probably something like Democracy in America by Tocqueville for the Americans. Namely, for those who are relatively educated about American history, they know about Democracy in America, but I guess most of them have not read the book. The only difference is that this book is very short. You can read it in 20 minutes. And I believe that if one understood the 10 most, that's 10, that could be more or less, but broadly, the 10 most influential books to a nation, for a nation. I'm not talking about the religious books like the Quran, the Bible, the Torah, but the cultural, historical, political, artistic books. One would understand in its broad aspect this nation. So if you want to understand the French mind and the French spirit and French history and European and world history eventually, you have to understand this book. Okay. I will talk about briefly the context, the historical context. I go to the point. Ernest Renan was born officially in 1823, so at the beginning of the 19th century, almost 2 centuries ago. He went to a religious school. He then lost his faith, and he graduated. That's not the proper term, but that's the idea. He got a degree, a very high degree, almost a doctorate, I guess, in philosophy. He wrote books about the Semitic languages, religious history, the life of Jesus. So he was interested in language, Oriental peoples, but also Christianity. In 1869, he was a candidate as a deputy, not a senator, but a political man, I guess, but he as an independent. And in 1882, he made in the Sorbonne, which is a prestigious French university, basically, the conference "What is a Nation?" and then he wrote a book about the history of the people of Israel later, and he died eventually in 1892. So he was a man of the 19th century, and the broad historical context of the speech, namely in 1882, France was in the midst of what we call the Third Republic. The First Republic was during the French Revolution. The Second Republic was between 1848 and 1852. Then there was the Second Empire by Napoleon III, and the Second French Empire collapsed after the defeat against the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which gave birth to the modern German nation and the Second German Reich by Bismarck. And so in 1882, we were historically in the midst of the Third Republic, which was the Republic. I made a video, the previous video is not, the Republic historically in France is a leftist idea. Today, it's the common constitutional and cultural structure of the whole nation. Everyone is a Republican, from the far left to the far right. Those who are accepted within the political spectrum, they are all Republicans, and they have to be Republicans in order to be tolerated. So it goes from communists to right-wing patriots. Yeah. And the question was, what is a nation? And the problem for France was the ethnic diversity. See my previous video if you're interested. Namely, all French were white, but there were ethnic divisions, what we call subspecies in anthropological term, within the French population. And he questioned himself, is a nation a racial determination, or is it more than that? Is it a civic, political unity? Is it an idea, or is it in the blood? That's a very important question, and this speech and the ideas that he develops have had a profound influence upon France and French history and upon world history at large. So he says in the beginning, the preface, my purpose is to analyze with you, so it's a speech officially, to analyze with you an idea apparently clear, but who can bring about the most dangerous misunderstandings, the idea of a nation. So he begins to talk about human units, human beings living together, and he distinguishes agglomerations, kind of empires like China, Egypt, Babylonia, tribes like the Jews and the Arabs, city-states like Athens and Sparta, Charlemagne's empire, which was a unity of various countries, religious communities like the Jews, and modern-day nations like France, England, and the modern nations of Europe in the context of 19th century, late 19th century Europe. And he says that there are kinship, the word is parenté, the equivalent would be kinship. Parenté comes from parent, but it's not necessarily the direct parent, it's the broad family. There are kinship like race, or rather language, which are established between the various branches of the Germans and the Slavs. So for him, the Germans, the Germanic and the Slavic peoples were united more than language than by race. So yeah. Second point. He talks about the French Revolution, and that's a very important idea that we find in Hegel, namely that the French revolutionary were motivated by the ideals of antiquity. They idealized Sparta and Athens, and the speeches during the French Revolution, especially in the most radical factions, the radical leftist in the then context, but the leftist of the French Revolution had nothing to do with the modern day leftist, maybe the kind of fanaticism, but they were hardcore civic patriots and nationalists. So yeah, and they were opposed to the right-wingers, and the right-wingers were the reactionary religious traditionalists. So yeah, and they kept talking about virtue, patriotism, the city, duty, and they were inspired by Rome and Sparta. And Hegel, in his encyclopedia, notes that each constitution has its own measure, which is a unity of quantity and quality, and each constitution is fitted, is adapted to a certain quantitative determination, and once the quantity of people crosses the measure, the constitution is no longer adequate and relevant. So there are constitutions which are made for a small land with a relatively small people, but if you enlarge, increase, develop both geographically and demographically the people, the constitution will not be suitable anymore. And the idea is that the will to apply constitutions like that of Sparta or Rome, the classical Republican Rome, where the city was very limited and basically all the citizens knew each other more or less and were closely related. This attempt to apply these constitutions to a country like France, which had basically, I think, 26 million inhabitants at the end of the 18th century, in the moment of the French Revolution, was self-defeating. And an example would be Switzerland and the US, which are very republican, free country in their constitution, but the constitution of the US was developed at the beginning for a very small population, and now it's a country of more than 320 million inhabitants. So the question is the constitution as thought about by the founding fathers still relevant for a multi-ethnic, multiracial country of more than 300 million people? So that's, I guess, a question which is debated in American politics. Then third point, he says that there is a very serious mistake that is often made, is to mistake precisely to confund the confusion between race and nation. So in his view, it's distinguished, it must be distinguished. He says that we should try and seek to arrive at precision and accuracy in these very difficult questions where the most unimportant, the most little confusion about the meaning of words can bring about errors in reasoning and dramatic errors and mistakes. And he says we should treat the living as if we were treating the dead by being cold, detached, and impartial, being fair, by being objective. That's his ambition. So in France, we have this obsession with words, namely that words should be accurately defined. I mean, I speak here as a French, although I'm not strictly speaking just a French, but as a Frenchman, we are obsessed with the meaning of words and language and accuracy in using the right and the proper meaning for words and so on and so forth. Okay. Then he talks briefly about European geopolitics. So I simplify briefly. He talks about, of course, the Roman Empire and the collapse of the Roman Empire, then the rise of the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne in the 8th or 9th, the beginning of the 9th century, and then the fragmentation and the division of the Carolingian Empire and the separation between Charlemagne's great-grandchildren between Eastern, Western, and Middle Empire. The eastern part became Germany, the western part became France, I simplify, and the middle part became a source of conflict. And he says that since the time of Charlemagne's empire, so the 9th century after AD, Europe has been basically divided into nations, and each nation has at some moment attempted to exert a hegemony, a political domination over others. And he says that the division of Europe is too great so that an attempt to dominate all other nations by one nation cannot help but provoke a counter-reaction and a unity of all the other nations against the challenger. So every time that a nation has grown too powerful in Europe, all the other nations, basically, not all, but most other nations have united and in a coalition against the rising nation to prevent its rise and to bring it back to its own place. So there's this constant story of conflicts and rise and decline and balance and lack of balance in European history. And he says that today, so in the context of the end of 19th century, the nations are well structured and defined: France, England, Germany, Russia, and so on and so forth. Fifth point, the idea of nation in antiquity, in ancient times. He says that the idea of a nation is relatively new in history, and in his view, antiquity did not know the nation, the idea of the nation, as we moderns understand this. Classical antiquity had republics, what he called royal municipalities, which are small kingdoms, basically, confederations, empires, and gathering of peoples, like he says, the geographical territory of Italy, France, and Spain under the Roman domination, or before the Roman domination, were gathering of peoples. There were inhabitants in modern day France, Spain, and Italy, although the names did not exist, but there was no political and even probably no cultural self-conscious unity. It was just a gathering of tribes and peoples. So, yeah. And he said that there were, of course, the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, Alexander's Empire, but they were not fatherlands, patrie in French. They were empires, but there was no Alexandrian patriot or Persian patriot or Assyrian patriot. Yeah. Now, he talks about the Roman Empire. And in order to understand the French mindset, one has to understand the tremendous cultural, political, ideological influence that the Roman Empire has had upon French history. And he says that maybe the Roman Empire was a patrie, namely a fatherland, because it enabled a great association. It brought unity, order, peace, and civilization. That's what we call the Pax Romana. And the French have been nostalgic all along their history about the Pax Romana, which is the period for the French going from the conquest of Caesar until broadly the 3rd century AD and eventually the collapse. But for a few centuries, France, which was not France because France was officially born with the Frankish invasion in the 5th century, but the territory of modern day France enjoyed a relative stability, prosperity, peace, order, civilization, and thriving in a way. Yeah. So then he talks about the Germanic invasions, and in his view, these are the Germanic barbarians which gave birth to the modern nationalities and the modern nations. And he says, in his view, I'm not sure that it's true, that they did not change significantly the racial aspect because they were not numerous enough. So the populations of Spain, northern Italy, France remained what they had been before the Germanic invasion, in his view. So the racial aspect was not strongly influential, but they influenced the ideology and they imposed dynasties and an aristocratic military power upon the lands of the former Western Roman Empire. And he talks about France, which comes from the Franks, a Germanic tribe, Burgundy, which comes from a Germanic tribe, which is a part of France and Western Europe, Lombardy, which is a part of northern Italy, Normandy, later, which is a northern part of France. These are all Germanic lands founded by Germanic tribes. And he says that the Frankish Empire, under Charlemagne, which was kind of a successor to the Frankish idea of unifying the western part of the empire, was the moment of the revival of the unity of the West, the western part of the Roman Empire in the 9th century. And the Treaty of Verdun, which in my view is 843, I think, between the grandsons of Charlemagne, brought about divisions. Like I said before, the western part became France, the eastern part became Germany, and the middle part became a source of conflict between France and Germany for the centuries to come. Yeah. So there is this nostalgic view in France that Germany and France were united under Charlemagne, and then the unity broke off, and the entire history of France and Germany and Europe for the past 1,200 years has been a story of conflict and trying to re-establish this lost and primordial unity. Okay. He asked the question, what is the characteristic, the feature, the determination of these different states? He says, the fusion of the populations which compose the states. He talks here about, for instance, France, England, Italy, Spain, Germany, which are the modern nations of his day. And he distinguishes this unity of the populations within a same nation, which is dubious because countries like Germany are ethnically divided in the northern and the southern part, and Italy, it's even more marked. The northern Italians and the southern Italians differ significantly from an ethnic and racial standpoint. So, and France also. So his view was the view of his time, but modern anthropology shows that there are divisions within the white European population. And he distinguishes his view of this unifying nations with the example of what he calls Turkey, which would be the Ottoman Empire, where the Slavs, the Greeks, the Armenians, the Arabs, the Syrians, the Kurds, and the Turks live together, but as separated ethnic, religious, cultural entities. And for him, this view, this multicultural, multi-ethnic state is not good in his view. So he's not a racial nationalist, he's not a multiculturalist, he's a nationalist in a sense of a patriotic, ideological, civic nationalist. Yeah. 10th point. He talks about conquest and religion, and when the conqueror, in the history of Europe, mostly being Germanic tribes, when the conqueror adopts the same religion as the one who has been conquered, the dominant and the dominated, the distinction between the races tend to disappear, because a unity of religion tend to favor, in the long term, a unity of blood, because people have no religious divide, so they marry, intermarry, and the gene pool becomes mixed eventually. That's his view. Now he talks about the Germanic tribes and women. I just expose his view. I don't know if it's true, but it has played a significant role upon the French mindset. He says that the Franks, the Burgunds, the Goths, the Lombards, the Normans, which are all Germanic Nordic tribes, did not take many women with them. So in his view, the racial impact has not been very important, because their wives were what he calls Latin, but Latin is not an anthropological determination, it's a cultural determination. The Latin race is a delusion. So here is limited by the lack of knowledge of his time. But in his view, these Germanic tribes that I've just mentioned did not brought many women, Germanic women, with them, whereas in his view, in England, the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes, eventually he doesn't mention them, but the Anglo-Saxons took their women with them. So in his view, England was a Germanic, Nordic, although he doesn't use the word Nordic, but a Germanic country, because the population was descended from the Germanic invaders. That's the view that he had. 12th point. He says that France became the name of a country where only a tiny minority of Franks, Germanic tribes, had entered the country. So in his view, the Franks gave the name to France, but the population was the same as before. He doesn't talk about the Celtic population, but it is said that the French were a Celtic people. The Gauls, before France became France, it was Gaul, were a Celtic people. But his view is that the genetic, he doesn't use the word genetic, but in modern day, the genetic impact of the Germanic invaders, the Franks, was limited. And he says that in his view, in the Middle Ages, the divide between the people of France was along social status, the nobility, the aristocracy, and the common folk, and there was very strong divides between the aristocratic mindset and the common vulgar aspect. So France was a very aristocratic country with very marked difference in social status, but in his view the difference was not ethnic. There was no ethnic consciousness of an ethnic divide within the French population. And here his view contradicts the view of Stoddard, Lothrop Stoddard, in the previous video that I made. Stoddard said that the dominant aristocracy was Nordic and the dominated peasantry was mostly Alpine. So here the views contradict, but it's by a conflict of opposing view that one arrive at the truth eventually. Okay. Then he talks about nations, history, historical studies, errors, and violence, he says, that's still relevant to today, forgetfulness, historical error are an essential factor in the creation of a nation. He says that in order to create a nation as a political, ideological entity, one has to forget some aspects of history and make some errors. So it's part of a delusional process. And the leftists say that nationalism is a mythology, in a sense that for them it's a delusion, a manipulation of those who want to impose the idea of nationality. So yeah, he says that the progress of historical studies is often a danger for the idea of nationality, because when you investigate the past, you bring to light facts of violence which are at the root cause of almost all, if not all, political formations. When you dig into the past, you discover that all states were founded upon violence eventually. A peaceful formation of a state does not exist. So that's what he says. He says that the unity is always produced with brutality. And he says that the kings of France, so we are in the context of a republican man. He is not an aristocrat, he's not a royalist, he's a republican, but he says that the kings of France, the idea of the king, does still exist within the mind of cultivated, educated Frenchmen, and they know what the kings of France have done. And there is, in the right-wing spheres of his time and still today, the idea that France was made by 40 kings. So the idea of the right-wing Catholics is that France is not the France of the past 200 years, the republican, atheistic France, but the Catholic, aristocratic, royal France made by 40 kings from Clovis to Louis XVI, and then Louis XVIII and Charles X, etc. But yeah, that's the view of the right-wing Catholics. Yeah, they are nostalgic of the king. Then he talks about political divisions, memories, and history, and it's still relevant. It's applicable to any nation, that's universal. But here he talks about the particular cases of Hungary, Austria, Bohemia, which would be the equivalent of modern Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and the Ottoman Empire, what he calls Turkey. In these countries, the rulers historically have not produced unity, because there still are ethnic divisions in his times in these countries, and it played an important role in the unfolding of European history with the First and Second World War. The ethnic tensions and divisions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire with the Habsburg, the will of Hitler to unite part of Bohemia to the German Reich, the fragmentation and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. So he understood very well. He says that in these countries, when there is divide between various communities, whether they are ethnic, religious, cultural, each community has its own memories and they have almost nothing in common. And he says that's a fundamental idea in Renan, which played a tremendous role and still keep playing a tremendous role in French politics. The idea that the essence of a nation, in his view, is that all individuals share a lot of things in common, but also they should forget some others. So it's kind of a delusion. We remember some aspects and we leave aside some others which are not pleasant to remember. That's his view of a nation, a community which shares memories together. It's very important to understand the French mindset. Then he talks about the idea of unity in Europe, and he develops three different kind of unities. What he calls the unity produced by a dynasty of an aristocratic king, a family of kings, an aristocratic dynasty. And the example is France, where the unity of France historically has been produced by the will of the monarch, the dynasty, he talks about the example of a direct will of the people, basically, namely the example of the Netherlands, but also Switzerland or Belgium. It's the will of, he doesn't say the will of the people, but it's, one would say, a will coming from below, not from above, but it's the will of the population to form a political unit. So that's the second example. And finally, he mentions a different kind of unity brought about by a general spirit, or the spirit of a military leader. And the example which had been recent in his time, namely Italy and Germany, where it is a higher will which created the political unity of both Italy and Germany. Bismarck for Germany in this case. So these are the three modes of producing unity in the history of Europe in his day. Now, about France, the French Revolution and nationalism. He says that, in his view, it is the glory of France to have, through the French Revolution, to have proclaimed the idea of a nation, and the idea that a nation exists by itself, out of its own self, autonomous in a way. That's not the word he uses, but exist par elle-même, exist through itself and by itself. And he says that the principle of nations is our principle, the principle of the French, but also of the 19th century. Yeah. And then he asks the question, but what is a nation? That's the title of the book. What is a nation? And he uses example. In his view, the Netherlands are a nation. Switzerland is a nation, although Switzerland is divided into 3 languages, 2 religions, and what he calls 3 or 4 races, which are subdivision of the European race. So, in spite of the linguistic, religious, and anthropological divide, in his view, Switzerland is a nation because it fits the criteria of political unity, shared memories, a will to live together, etc. And he says examples that Hanover, the duchy, I don't know what's the English word, Parma, the political entity of Parma in Italy, Austria. In his view, these are not nations. So for him, Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is a state but not a nation. And he asks the question, what is the difference between the principle of nationalities and the principle of races? What is the difference, the distinction, the opposition, the contradiction maybe between the idea of a nation and the idea of a race? And yeah. These questions are still relevant today, and more than relevant. Okay, he says he exposed the views of some political theorists. These are not his views, but he explains the views of some people that the nation is first and foremost a dynasty. So the idea is that it is the will of the royal house of the king on the aristocracy, the dynasty to create, to structure, and to maintain the nation. That's the classical royalist view, which was still very important and very dominant in Europe up until the end of the First World War. The idea that the nation belongs to the royal family, basically. And he says that most of modern nations have been shaped by, indeed, a royal family or a feudal family. And he uses examples. He says that revolutionary France, the limits of France in 1789, so before the revolution, before the outburst of the French Revolution, the limits, the geographical determinations of France had nothing natural, in the sense that there was no spontaneous geographical unity. France was what it was because of a political will. It's not the landscapes which brought about unity, because there is no natural geographical spontaneous unity which bring about the shape of political France. It's a political will. He says that in Britain, the will to unite England, Ireland, and Scotland was the result of a dynastic will. He says that Italy, which had been divided for so long before becoming a modern nation state, it is the lack of power or the lack of will from the various dynasties to bring about unity. That's why Italy had been divided throughout the centuries and the millennia since the fall of Rome and before 19th century and the reunification. And he says that even the Netherlands, they were a free republic, but they were connected to the House of Orange, to the dynasty also. So even in the most free republics, there is still this dynastic will. And he gives counterexamples, namely Switzerland and the United States of America, in which there is no dynastic royal basis. It's strictly a republican will. So, yeah. He talks about royalty, the kings of France, and he says that in France, the kings had already an idea of the nation, and that the nation, the French nation, although it did not consciously exist before the ideas of the French Revolution, it was already there, so to speak. And the proof, he says that the proof that the greatest homage that one could pay to the French kings, coming from a republican, that's a great homage, is that the kings had already built the nation, and the nation was so well built that it could function without the king. So that's quite comical, and that's paying homage to an opponent, and yeah. Okay. Then he talks about the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment. He doesn't use the word les Lumières, but that's the Age of Enlightenment. He says that the 18th century had changed everything because there was a revival of the ideas of antiquity in the realm of politics. The previous centuries had seen the re-emergence of antiquity in the realm of philosophy, art, and here in the 18th century, the ideas of antiquity, basically ancient Greece and ancient Rome, had become prominent and dominant, and the ideas of patriotism, virtue, civic virtue, rights, self-determination, self-rule, a political unit where all the citizens would participate, like in ancient Sparta. In ancient Sparta, all the citizens participated, but not all the people, because there were the helots, the slaves, and in the Roman Republic there were the divide between the patricians and the plebeians, but those who had citizens' right participated in the political life. So this revival of antiquity was very strong in the 18th century in France, and eventually in someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and eventually it gave birth, and also Montesquieu, and it gave birth eventually to the French Revolution, the will to re-establish virtue, patriotism, self-rule, self-determination, citizenship, and these are the kind of ideas which gave birth to the French Revolution. Okay. And he says, yeah, he questions, sorry, I just, yeah, I forgot to annote the book. So he talks about the idea that a nation can exist without the dynastic principle, and indeed there are nations who have been formed and shaped and structured by dynasties and who keep on existing without the dynasty. So that's the revolutionary idea that nations do not need kings. It was a very revolutionary idea in 18th century France, of course, but still in the 19th century, where most European states were dominated by kings and royal families. And the irony is that today, people in France and in the whole Western world say that not only the nation can live without the king, but also without the people. There's this idea that you can replace the historical people of a nation, and the nation doesn't cease to be a nation. That's the view that is shared by leftists and even conservatives throughout the Western world. The idea that America can exist without white Americans, that France can exist without white Frenchmen, that England can exist without the white English, etc., etc. So from we don't need the kings, the modern idea 2 centuries later is we don't need the people. So yeah. Okay, so he asks what is the foundation of national rule? What is national rule or ruling or government founded upon? He envisioned the view of those who believe that a nation is a race. So he discussed this idea of which he is opposed to, but he explains the idea. He says that in spite of all the artificial divisions, political, geographical, whatever, what remains stable, fixed, set is the race, the biological determinations of the populations, the anthropological aspects. It remains stable in the midst of all the dynastic, political change. If you change the form of the government, republic, kingship, a kingdom, whatever, an empire, the population remains the same. That's the view of those who say that race is important. And he develops the idea of German imperialism, what he calls Germanism, which gets down to pan-Germanism. So I will call this Germanism, namely German imperialism. He's not a German imperialist, but he knows that in Germany there are imperialists, and he says that in their view, all the members of the German family belong together, and that the German imperialists have a right, founded upon the idea of race, to bring back together, to bring back to unity all the members of Germany, whatever their nationality is, even if these peoples, Germans living in Austria, Bohemia, parts of Poland, parts of France, parts of Switzerland, whatever, parts of northern Germany, even if they are not politically German, the German imperialists believe that they belong to Germany, so that the German imperialists have a right to reclaim what is theirs and to conquer, to reunite the Germans. So the speech is from 1882. That's what basically Hitler attempted to do some 60 years later. And he says that this view is a great error, a great mistake. He says that the principle of nations, as he envisioned this, a civic ideological unity, is fair and just and legitimate, but the primordial right of races, the Germanic idea, the German idea, is narrow and full of danger for real progress. That's his view. Yeah. So he was a very smart man because he understood geopolitics and very well. And now we have the view of race in antiquity. He said that in antiquity, the tribe and the city-state, for the tribe and the city-state, race had a very important, prominent role, because the tribe and the city-states originally, like Sparta, Athens, and the Republican Rome, were extensions of a family. It is said sometimes that a nation is an extended family, so in a nation, in this view, there is a unity of blood, and eventually the primordial Athenians and Spartans and Romans were united by blood. They were a nation in the biological sense. And then he says, he opposed the view of the city-states and the tribes with the idea of the Roman Empire, in which he says that the Roman Empire was shaped and formed by violence, but maintained by interest, and this in this great agglomeration of cities or towns, very different provinces were united together, and this Roman imperialist view was a strike, a blow, a hit against the idea of race. And he says that the Roman idea, the imperial idea of Rome, to unite people of various races or ethnicity under one rule, and the Christian idea, with its universal and universalist view, the unity of Rome and Christianity work very efficiently in the same direction, in his view. Namely, these are agents of unification, and in his view, what he calls the ethnographic reason, which is the idea of nation as a race or as an anthropological foundation, the idea of blood, basically, has been left off, separated, left aside, abandoned for centuries because of the converging influence of these two ideas, the imperial Roman idea and the Christian idea. And the history of Europe is a tension between the Christian Empire and the principle of nationalities. One way of interpreting the Reformation is, of course, the religious aspect, but also some say that Martin Luther was a German nationalist, and that Protestantism was Germanic nationalism expressed in the realm of religion. It's not completely true, but it's not completely false either. There's an aspect of nationalism in Protestantism, in a historical aspect, and there has been a constant conflict between the Christian Roman Empire and mostly the Germanic nationalistic will. And it was prevalent in the 19th century, and it became more than obvious with the First World War and then with the rise of National Socialism. And yeah, so that's what could be said. I've commented half of the book. I don't know if I will comment the second half, maybe this afternoon if I had the opportunity, but you understand broadly the ideas of how the French envision nationalism, because every thinking Frenchman is aware of these ideas, basically, and most share these ideas, but these are Republican, patriotic, non-racist. Racism was not thought about in this term in the 19th century in terms of within a same state, but these are anti-racist, one could say in the modern language, anti-racist, patriotic, universalist ideas, but a part of the left in today's context rejects this idea because they say that patriotism on the very idea of nation, even a nation which would not be founded upon any ethnic principle, is bad. But most of those who claim themselves to be patriots, and in today's France, there are almost no self-proclaimed nationalists because nationalism is not tolerated by the Republic. So those who claim to be patriots, they still adopt this view of the nation. And there are very, very few people in France who have a racial view of the nation. Very few. And usually when they do, they are pro-German. So yeah, that's what I could say about France, the idea of nation, the idea of race, and Ernest Renan in 48 minutes. And it might enable you to understand the present-day election and present-day France and the world at large, and the Western world especially. So